Ever wondered how the British Empire's thirst for profit led to the exploitation of entire nations and the devastating consequences of the opium trade with China? Dive into this captivating journey of greed, power, and exploitation as we uncover the dark chapters of history in our latest clip. The East India Company, a powerful trading entity chartered by the British Crown in the 17th century, became synonymous with the expansion of British influence in the Indian subcontinent and the lucrative trade routes with China. Over time, its scope vastly expanded, encompassing not just trade in spices but also in cotton, silk, tea, and other goods. As it grew in power and influence, the East India Company became a de facto arm of the British government, playing a crucial role in the imperial control over India. Its private armies and corporate governance laid the foundations for British colonial rule in the Indian subcontinent. The victory in Battle of Plassey in 1757 established British control over Bengal and laid the foundation for the company's subsequent expansion across the Indian subcontinent for next century. The East India Company began trading with China in the early 17th century. Britain had a high demand for Chinese goods, like tea, silk, and porcelain, but had few products of interest to offer in exchange, except for silver. So, the British faced a significant trade imbalance with China. Consequently, the British began the opium trade with China in the late 18th century as a means to address trade imbalances and generate revenue. There was also high demand for opium in China during the 18th and 19th centuries. One way they did this was by taking the agricultural lands and turning them into poppy production. This conversion of agricultural lands for poppy cultivation by the British East India Company in Bengal had devastating consequences for the local population. This causes severe food shortages, which led to the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, resulting in widespread starvation and loss of life, with estimates of millions perishing during this tragic event. Back in China, as addiction grew, the demand for Indian opium increased. The revenue from opium became a significant part of the British East India Company's income, helping to finance the British colonial administration in India. The Qing dynasty in China attempted to halt the opium trade due to the devastating social and economic effects of widespread addiction among the Chinese population. Millions of Chinese fell victim to addiction, causing profound economic and social repercussions for the nation. In the late 1830s, the Chinese government implemented a ban on drug trafficking, but British drug merchants disregarded the law with impunity. Chinese authorities responded by seizing and eliminating drug shipments. However, the drug cartels wielded considerable influence, with connections reaching in British government. Many members of parliament and cabinet ministers were financially invested in these drug companies, exerting pressure on the government to intervene. In 1840, Britain officially declared war on China under the pretext of promoting free trade, showcasing a stark example of how governments prioritize the interests of wealthy entities. This conflict, known as the First Opium War, unfolded between Britain and China from 1840 to 1842. The outcome was heavily one-sided, as the Chinese proved to be no match for Britain's advanced weaponry and military capabilities. In the ensuing peace treaty, China conceded to refrain from restricting the operations of British drug merchants and to provide compensation for damages caused by Chinese authorities. Additionally, the British demanded and were granted control of Hong Kong, which they utilized as a secure hub for drug trafficking. Hong Kong remained under British control until 1997. By the late 19th century, approximately 40 million Chinese individuals, accounting for a tenth of the nation's population, were addicted to opium. By 1880, annual imports of opium in China had surged to 6,500 tons, a stark increase from the mere 347 tons recorded in 1822. The Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860 resulted in further concessions for foreign powers in China, including legalized opium trade and expanded foreign enclaves. These wars significantly weakened China's sovereignty and contributed to the decline of the Qing dynasty. Later, a combination of domestic and international factors contributed to the eventual decline and cessation of the opium trade between Britain and China. While it took several decades and significant diplomatic and societal changes, the trade eventually came to an end by the early 20th century. We must learn from history's mistakes, recognizing the devastating impact of greed and exploitation. Only through cooperation, empathy, and ethical trade practices can we build a more just and equitable world. Please subscribe to the channel for more interesting stories.